She spoke her mind to her father's rude guest at dinner. She did not know he was the Alpha King. Her grandmother used to say, "A wolf that bares its throat is not defeated. It is asking to be truly known." Vesper Calloway had never owned a wolf. No shift had ever come for her on her 16th moon. No howl had risen from the marrow of her bones. She was the only wolfless girl in 3 generations of the Calloway bloodline, and her father reminded her of this in the subtle, waterlogged ways that fathers do. By introducing her last, by seating her at the far end of every table, by choosing her older sister, Rina's opinions, over hers in every room she entered. Still, she carried her grandmother's saying folded inside her chest like a letter she'd memorized but never sent. She did not know, on that particular autumn evening, with the smell of pine resin and cold rain on the wind, that the night would ask her to bare her throat at last. She did not know who would be watching when she did. Chapter 1. The Important Guest. The Calloway estate sat at the eastern hem of Thornvale, a pack town old enough that moss grew inside the wrought iron gate rather than on it. The main house was 3 stories of gray stone and inherited debt, its south-facing windows looking out over a garden that Vesper tended alone because no one else bothered. She grew night-blooming cereus along the lower wall and verbena in the broken urns, and a single frost-stubborn rose at the garden's center that came back every spring, despite everything. Her father, Aldrich Calloway, was a mid-rank lord of the territory, wealthy enough to host visiting dignitaries, not wealthy enough to refuse them. He had 2 daughters. Rina was 23, wolf-blessed and ambitious, her dark hair always arranged into something architectural. Vesper was 20, wolfless and habitually overlooked, her dark hair perpetually escaping whatever she'd tried to do with it. On the evening in question, Aldrich gathered them both in the front hall while the cook rushed past with a rack of venison. "The guest tonight is a man of considerable standing." He adjusted his cuffs in the hall mirror without quite looking at either of them. "I need absolute decorum. Rina, wear the copper dress." Rina smoothed a smile. "Of course, father." "Vesper." He paused in a way that felt like an afterthought. "Sit at the far end and don't speak unless you're spoken to." Vesper dipped her chin in acknowledgement. She had learned not to argue the seating arrangement, just as she had learned not to correct him when he forgot she'd already read the book he recommended, or when he called her Garden the Weeds. Some battles she stored like stones in a pocket, waiting. She wore the green dress, not because her father suggested it, but because it was the color of her grandmother's parlor, and wearing it felt like carrying company into hostile rooms. The guest arrived at 7:30. She heard him before she saw him. Not the man himself, but the shift in atmosphere that followed him through the door. The way her father's posture changed from stiff to genuflecting. The way Rina touched her own collar in unconscious self-presentation. Vesper stood at the threshold of the sitting room and watched a tall man hand his coat to the housekeeper without looking at her, say something low and dismissive to Aldrich's opening pleasantry, and then survey the room the way a person surveys a map they've already memorized. His name, as her father introduced him, was Lord Caspendray. He was broad-shouldered and black-haired, with a jaw cut from the same gray stone as the house walls, and eyes the deep amber of a wolf's iris in firelight. He wore a charcoal wool jacket with a silver pin at the lapel. A wolf's head, but small, almost private. He did not smile when introduced. He assessed. When his gaze crossed Vesper at the room's edge, it lingered 1 beat longer than strictly polite, then moved on. She catalogued him the way she catalogued all her father's guests, by what they revealed without intending to. Lord Dray revealed that he was accustomed to the room reshaping itself around him. He revealed that he found the reshaping tedious. He revealed, when he spoke to Aldrich about territorial water rights, that he had read every document before arriving and found Aldrich's opening summary redundant. He was, she decided privately, extraordinarily rude. She went to set the last place at the dinner table and found the kitchen girl, Meta, nearly in tears by the sideboard. "He sent back the first wine," Meta whispered, "without tasting it." Vesper squeezed her arm. "Bring the elderflower cordial. If he sends that back too, he can drink rain." Meta choked on a small laugh. Chapter 2. The dinner. The table was long enough that Vesper could observe the far end, her father's end, Rina's end, Lord Dray's end, without being obligated to it. She ate slowly and listened. Caspin Dre was not precisely rude in the way of men who don't know better. He was rude in the way of men who have decided that certain performances are beneath them. The performance of social warmth, of pretended interest, of the small comedies that make a dinner table livable. He answered Aldrich's questions with numerical precision. He accepted Rinna's carefully deployed laughter, with a short, upward twitch of his mouth that could charitably be called a smile. When a question about the Thornvale Pack's hunting yields was posed to the table generally, Rinna answered with confidence. Caspin listened, made a brief corrective that contradicted her figure entirely, and offered no softening. Aldrich said nothing. Rinna's smile went porcelain. Vesper poured herself more water. Then the moment arrived that would change the shape of her life, though she did not know it yet. It arrived in the form of Meta, who was carrying the soup tureen with both hands, and passing behind Lord Dre's chair when he pushed his chair back sharply to reach for a document he'd inexplicably placed on the sideboard. Nobody placed documents on the dining room sideboard, which was why Meta had not anticipated it. The chair caught Meta's wrist. The tureen tipped. Hot soup sloshed across the serving cloth and onto Meta's apron. Meta yelped softly and went rigid, waiting for condemnation. Dre looked at the spilled soup, then at Meta, and said, with the flat neutrality of a man commenting on weather, "Clumsy." Silence sealed the room. Aldrich's eyes moved to his plate. Rinna reached for her wine. The housekeeper appeared in the doorway and hovered, unsure. Vesper set down her fork. It wasn't her fault. Her voice was clear and even, and carried to the head of the table without effort. You pushed your chair back without warning. She had no way to step aside. Every head turned. Aldrich's face had the expression of a man watching a bridge collapse. Caspin Dre looked at her for the first time as though she were a specific person rather than furniture. I beg your pardon? The spill was caused by the chair. She kept her gaze on his. Her heart was doing something loud inside her ribs, but her voice remained its own calm country. Meta has been serving this house for 4 years without incident. If you're going to assign blame, it should land accurately. The silence after this was of a different quality, not sealed, but stretched. Caspin Dre looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he looked at Meta. Are you hurt? Meta blinked. No, my lord. Only startled. He said nothing further. He retrieved his document and set it in his lap, where it belonged. He did not apologize, but he did not dismiss it either. Something in the set of his jaw had changed almost imperceptibly, the way a dial turns one small notch. Vesper picked up her fork. Her father was staring at her with controlled fury. She ate her soup. Chapter 3. After the table. Her father found her in the hallway afterward, while Rinna was pouring Lord Dre's brandy in the sitting room with practiced elegance. Aldrich's voice was the lowest she'd heard it go in years, which meant he was genuinely angry. What possessed you? He blamed Meta for his own carelessness. He is a guest in this house. He is a man of enormous— You have no idea who that man is. I know who Meta is. Vesper held her father's gaze. 4 years. She has never dropped anything. This is not about dropped soup, Vesper. This is about— He stopped himself, composed. Go to your room. I'll manage the evening. She went, but not directly. She went by way of the kitchen, where she found Meta sitting with a cup of tea, her apron changed, her eyes still slightly too bright. You didn't need to do that, Meta said. He's someone important. Important people make worse messes when nobody points out the chair. Meta laughed properly this time, and the brightness in her eyes turned into something warmer. Vesper climbed to her room on the 3rd floor, the one under the eaves where the ceiling sloped and the window looked over her garden. She could see the frost-stubborn rose in the moonlight, a pale smudge against the dark. She sat on her window seat, with her knees drawn up, and thought about the 3 seconds Caspin Dre had looked at her, not through her, not past her, but at her, with the specific focus of a man recalibrating. She did not like him. He was cold and dismissive, and he had called Meta clumsy with the ease of someone for whom other people's distress was background noise. But she thought about the dial turning one small notch, and she thought, before she could stop herself, about amber eyes. Chapter 4. The morning summons. She did not expect to see him again. He was meant to leave before sunrise. She'd heard her father confirming it with the housekeeper. Something about a long ride north and early meetings at the Greywood Territorial Hall. She woke at dawn out of habit, pulled a shawl over her nightdress, and went to check on the rose, which had been looking peaked since the last cold snap. The garden was silver with frost. Her breath preceded her in small clouds. She was crouching at the base of the rose, pressing her fingers into the soil around its roots, still alive, still holding, when she heard the gate creak behind her. Caspin Dre was standing at her garden gate in his traveling coat. For a moment they regarded each other across the frost-silvered rows of sleeping verbena. His expression was difficult to read in the dawn light, but he was clearly surprised to find her there, which meant he had come to the garden for another reason. Perhaps simply to look at it, the way she'd seen people pause at things that surprised them with their own beauty. "You grow this," he said. It wasn't a question. "For 4 years? About as long as Meta has been serving the house." She stood up, brushing soil from her fingers, and did not pretend she hadn't made the comparison intentional. Something moved in his expression that she couldn't categorize. "I was going to say—" He stopped, began again, and the beginning was slightly rougher than before, like a hinge not recently used. "I was unkind at the table last night. To the girl." Vesper waited. "You were correct that I moved the chair without care." She studied him. He was not a man who softened this kind of statement with disclaimers, and there were none now. It was bare and accurate, and cost him something. "It would mean more if you told Meta that than me," she said, "but I appreciate that you said it." "I spoke to her this morning before she began her duties." Vesper's carefully maintained neutrality wobbled slightly. She had not expected that. "Then I retract the first part," she said. "I appreciate it entirely." He looked at the rose. "What is that variety? I don't recognize it." "I don't know the variety. It was here when I came. Every winter I think it's finally finished, and every spring it comes back. Persistent. Stubborn," she corrected. "There's a difference. Persistent has a plan. This rose just refuses to accept the alternative." He looked at her then, that specific calibrating look again, longer this time. "My name is not simply Lord Dre," he said. "I should have been introduced fully. That failure was your father's, and I didn't correct it, which makes it mine as well." A cold finger moved up her spine that had nothing to do with the frost. "What is your full title?" There was a pause in which the world was very still. "Caspin Dre, Alpha of the Greywood Reach and the Thornvale Territories. The role your people call the Alpha King." The frost seemed to thicken. Vesper heard her grandmother's voice, very faintly. "A wolf that bares its throat is not defeated." She had spoken plainly to the Alpha King. She had corrected him at her father's dinner table in front of witnesses. She had told him his blame was misdirected, by name, with eye contact. She was wolfless. She was the overlooked daughter. She was standing in a frost-covered garden in a shawl over her nightdress. "I see," she said. "Do you regret what you said?" She thought about it honestly. She thought about Meta's face, going rigid and waiting. She thought about her father's eyes dropping to his plate. "No." Caspin Dre nodded, as though she had confirmed a theorem. "My carriage leaves in an hour," he said. "I'd like to walk the garden, if you have no objection." She gestured wordlessly at the frost-silvered rose, and he fell into step beside her, and they walked the whole perimeter of the garden in the cold dawn without rushing, and she told him the names of every plant, and he listened without once looking at anything except what she pointed to. When he left, he paused at the gate. "Your father told me you have no wolf." "My father tells everyone that." "Do you mind it? The absence?" She considered the question the way it deserved. "I mind that it made me invisible to people who only see wolves," she said. "I don't mind what I am." He held her gaze one final moment. "Good," he said, and left. Chapter 5. The Aftermath and the Letter. What followed was a week of her father's cold silence, then a campaign of carefully worded disappointment. She had embarrassed him, had failed to appreciate the delicacy of the alliance, had revealed herself as unmannered and hot-headed to the most powerful figure in the region. Rinna watched from doorways and said nothing, which was its own kind of mercy. Vesper tended her garden and read and helped Meta inventory the linen cupboard and thought about Amber Eyes more than was strictly sensible. The letter arrived on the 8th day. It was brought by a Greywood courier in formal livery, and it was addressed conspicuously not to Aldrich Calloway, but to Miss Vesper Calloway, Thornvale House. Her father's face when he brought it to her was a study in strangled bewilderment. She took it to her room and opened it at her window with the garden below her. The handwriting was spare and very even, as though its author had trained the natural urgency out of it. Miss Calloway, I am hosting a territorial summit at Greywood Hall in 3 weeks. I am inviting you as an official guest, in your own name and under your own standing. I do not make this request through your father because I am not asking his permission. I am asking yours. If you choose to come, a carriage will arrive on the morning of the 15th. If you prefer not to come, I will understand that also, and will think no less of you for it. I have been thinking about what you said regarding persistence and stubbornness. I think I may have confused the two in myself for some time. C. Dre. Tucked inside the letter was a small pressed flower, a sprig of frost-white verbena from her own garden, clipped with clean precision from the far corner bed, the one she hadn't thought he'd noticed at all. She pressed the sprig back between the letter's pages and sat for a long time with her garden below her, the stubborn rose very small and pale at its center. She wrote back the same afternoon. 1 line. I will be ready on the morning of the 15th. Chapter 6. Greywood Hall. She had expected grandeur and found it. Greywood Hall was stone and glass and arching timber, with Wolf Clan banners hanging in the great hall, and a mountain view from every eastern window. What she had not expected was how it felt from the inside, less like a palace, and more like a place still deciding what it wanted to be. Caspin met her at the entrance himself, without ceremony, which she later understood was itself a statement. Over 3 days she moved through the summit as his named guest. This created, she was aware, a low current of fascination and calculation in every room. Who was this wolfless girl from a minor Thornvale family, and why was she here, under her own standing? She felt the assessments. She met them with her grandmother's composure and her own garden-grown patience. On the first evening, there was a formal dinner, and she was seated beside Caspin. He spoke to her throughout the meal in the honest, direct way she was coming to recognize, as his natural register beneath the armor of his formal manner. He asked what she read, what she thought of the water rights dispute that apparently remained unsettled, how she had learned to grow things that survived frost. She answered with matching honesty, and found, against every expectation, that she was not performing for him, that the particular quality of his attention, that calibrating focus she'd first seen across her father's table, had the unusual effect of making her entirely herself, rather than a managed version of herself. On the second day, she attended a policy session about territorial medicine and welfare, pack members with no wolves, elderly lone wolves, those who'd lost their bonds to illness or age. She listened for an hour, then said quietly to the woman presenting, "Has anyone asked the wolfless members directly what they find most difficult? The policy reads as though it was designed by wolves imagining wolflessness, not by people who are living it." The room went still in the way rooms did when she spoke plainly. Caspin, at the head of the table, said nothing, but that evening he appeared at the door of the library, where she'd gone to read, and said, "I've asked Archivist Tenney to begin a direct consultation with wolfless pack members. Your question broke something open in there. I want you to know it mattered." She looked up from her book. His face in the firelight was, for the first time in her knowledge of him, entirely unarmored. "I don't have a wolf," she said. "I do have a very long experience of being a problem that other people defined without asking." He came further into the room and sat across from her, and they talked for 2 hours, about policy, and her grandmother's saying, and the difference between being unseen and being ignored, and about the weight of inherited authority on someone who had never wanted to be cold, had only needed to be certain. She understood, by the end of it, that Caspin Dre was not a cruel man who had become careless. He was a thorough man who had been performing certainty for so long that he'd forgotten the warmth was still underneath. She thought about the stubborn Rose, just refusing to accept the alternative. The third day he walked with her in the hall's own garden before she was to leave, and she was looking at a stone bench with lichen on it that pleased her architecturally when he stopped walking. "I would like to call on you, formally, repeatedly, with explicit intention." He said it in the same voice he used for policy declarations, which made it both funnier and more serious than it might have been. "I recognize you don't know me well, and I recognize my first impression was not. I was not at my best. You called Meta clumsy. I have apologized to Meta. I have thought about it considerably since. I am thinking about it now. That's a reasonable thing to be thinking about. I would like the chance to demonstrate that I can do better." The armor was fully down. "I would like the chance to know you properly." Vesper looked at the lichen on the bench, and at the frost-resistant hedgerow beyond it, and at this man who had looked at her for 3 seconds across a dinner table and recalibrated. "I'm wolfless," she said. It was not an apology. It was an act of honesty, the same honesty she had asked of him. "I know. My father has no standing worth in alliance. I know that also. Then what do you want?" "You," he said, "specifically. Not a bloodline or a political arrangement. The person who told me my blame was misdirected, and then went out in the frost to check on a rose." The garden was very quiet. "You may call on me," she said. "I'll want to see how you treat the people in rooms you don't think are important." His mouth curved then, a real smile, nothing like the polite twitch at her father's table. It transformed his whole face, made him look younger and considerably more dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with power. "That seems entirely fair," he said. Chapter 7. The Calling On. He called on her 7 times over the following 4 months. He was, she found, exactly as good as his word. She watched him in ordinary rooms, speaking with stable hands at Thornvale's lower edge, sitting in the kitchen briefly at her invitation, while Meta served them tea rather than the formal parlor, walking her garden in early winter with his hands in his pockets, asking the names of things. He never performed warmth. He grew it slowly and honestly, the way things grow in frost-resistant soil. The 4th visit, he brought her a book, a rare volume on wolfless pack histories that he had tracked down through 3 archivists. It was wrapped in plain cloth, no ceremony. He handed it to her at the garden gate and then looked at the rose, which had gone fully dormant. "Still there?" "Still there," she confirmed. On the 5th visit, she met him at the door because her father had taken to engineering reasons to be elsewhere. Aldrich Calloway was a man who updated his behavior when the political map changed, even if he never updated his understanding. On the 6th visit, he brought Meta a small jar of honey from Greywood's eastern hives, quietly, without announcement, pressing it into her hands in passing. Vesper saw it from the hallway and felt something in her chest move through a wall it had been pressing against for years. On the 7th visit, he sat across from her in the frost-cold garden with their breath making paired clouds in the air, and he held both her hands in his and asked her to be his mate. He asked. Did not assume. Did not declare. Asked. "The territory will say things," she said. "Let them. I have no wolf to offer your bloodline. I want your voice in every room where policy gets made. I want your garden growing at Greywood. I want someone who will look me in the eye when I've moved the chair carelessly." He turned her hands over in his. "I've been surrounded by people who let me be worse than I am. I don't want to be worse than I am." She bared her throat. Not literally, but in the way her grandmother meant. She stopped holding the word at the back of her teeth, stopped performing caution for its own sake. "Yes," she said. The frost-covered garden held them both, and the rose slept its stubborn winter sleep at its center, and somewhere in the estate Meta told the other kitchen girl, and there was a small, involuntary sound of celebration, which drifted up and out through a cracked window and into the cold, clear air. Chapter 8. The Wedding and What It Made. The ceremony was held at Greywood Hall on a day that had promised clouds and delivered extraordinary winter light instead. Low and silver, the kind that makes everything specific and luminous. Her father attended. He was formal and careful, and he placed her hand in Caspin's with the expression of a man who had revised his story just enough to be able to tell it without contradiction. Rinna stood in the 3rd row and cried, which Vesper had not expected. She caught Rinna's eye and saw something genuine there, not jealousy, but a kind of moved recognition, as though she was watching a thing that surprised her with its own truth. Meta was in the hall. Caspin had quietly ensured she had a place at a forward table. At the reception, a very senior lord of the Outer Territories, old, silver-haired, the kind of powerful who felt no need to display it, approached Vesper and introduced himself as Caspin's great-uncle, Wardle Dray. He was short and had laugh lines deep as furrows, and he looked her up and down with frank appraisal. "Wolfless," he said. "Yes." "Good." He said it with such decisive satisfaction that she blinked. "This family has been howling at the moon for 3 generations, and getting very little done. We need someone who'll point at the moon and ask why we're howling." Vesper laughed, genuinely without arrangement. Wardle Dray raised his glass to her and moved away. Caspin appeared at her shoulder. "What did he say?" "Something about the moon." "He's been saying things about the moon since I was 7. Whatever it was probably accurate." She leaned into him slightly, just slightly, the way new things lean before they know they're going to stay. And he put his hand at the small of her back, and she felt the room around them differently, felt herself occupying it fully for the first time, felt her edges reach all the way to the walls. That night, when the hall had quieted, she pressed the sprig of verbena, his first letter's gift, kept flat between book pages for 4 months, into the back of a small frame and set it on the windowsill of their rooms, which looked east over Greywood's mountain line. He watched her place it. "You kept that. I keep things that matter." He was quiet for a moment, and when he looked at her, it was the furthest from the armored summit lord he had been, open and certain and warm in the very specific way of people who've been cold for a long time and have finally, stubbornly, chosen the alternative. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall, very soft, covering everything in the patient and deliberate way that things are covered, that will be uncovered, in the spring. Epilogue. 1 year later. Spring had returned to Greywood. Vesper stood at the eastern window in early morning light, the mountain line clear and sharp against a sky that couldn't decide between blue and silver. On the sill before her, in its small frame, the sprig of frost-white verbena had dried to pale gold, fragile-looking but intact, the way things are intact that have been kept with care. Behind her she could hear Caspin moving in the dressing room. The low, unhurried sounds of a man who no longer woke rushed. He had changed in ways that were both subtle and enormous. He laughed more readily, deferred more honestly to expertise that wasn't his own, and had been heard on 2 separate occasions thanking stable staff by name without prompting. The wolfless consultation she'd broken open at the summit, her single question about whether anyone had asked the wolfless directly, had become policy. A formal council seat for non-wolf pack members had been established. The position was called, dryly and accurately, the unshifted advocate. She had been asked to design its charter. She had said yes, without hesitation. There was a note on the windowsill beside the verbena frame, slipped there this morning before she'd woken. Caspin's handwriting, spare and even. The rose survived. She had transferred her frost-stubborn rose to Greywood's garden in late autumn, tucking it into a south-facing corner bed with 2 good shovels of Thornvale soil around its roots, and had subsequently refused to worry about it in the way of people who trust stubborn things to know what they're doing. She'd checked on it twice. The second time it had looked not just alive, but quietly purposeful. Now she pressed the note flat under the verbena frame and felt the familiar folded letter in her chest unfolding. Her grandmother's saying, which she had carried so long it had become part of her breathing. "A wolf that bares its throat is not defeated. It is asking to be truly known." She had bared her throat to the most powerful person in the territory, over spilled soup and kitchen girl's dignity, not knowing who he was, not calculating the risk. And what had come back to her, slow and frost-resistant and stubborn as a rose that refused the alternative, was not defeat and not submission, but recognition, whole and true and mutual. She was wolfless. She was a lord's overlooked daughter from a moss-gated estate. She had spoken plainly at a dinner table to a man who'd forgotten what it meant to be looked at rather than deferred to. And here in the east-facing window, with the mountain light on her face and the dried verbena on its sill, and the rose down in the garden pressing new green to the cold spring air, she thought, known. The door opened, and Caspan's arms came around her from behind, and his chin dropped to her shoulder, and together they looked east into the morning. "Is it really up?" she asked. 3 new canes since last week." His voice was warm with private delight. "Completely impossible plant." "Stubborn," she said. "Not persistent." She felt him smile against her cheek. "There's a difference," he agreed. The verbena sprig caught the new light and held it, gold and dry and kept, and the mountain was very clear, and the rose was impossibly, stubbornly, magnificently alive. End.